I am so glad you are here with us today. And we are into our fourth part, I should say, on the U.S. Civil War. And what we're doing initially, as explained last time, is we are looking at the road to the war, because contextually, I don't think it's you can understand the event as well without having a backdrop. So we've been working our way through the backdrop. We've been summarizing. For some of you at Westminster who have been with me from last January of 19, some of this has been familiar, hopefully it's been familiar as we've made our way. And we've traveled through some of the events from the Declaration and the Constitution and then Andrew Jackson and even Manifest Destiny, and all those parts are leading us in. So what we've done, and I think I said this last time, is you can understand how we got into Civil War in both a broad structure, which is what we're studying, but also a narrow structure, kind of like what are the events that led to the Civil War. When I talk about my book about the pattern of great history, the great crisis moment in my book, looking at the specific attributes that we can see along the pathway, those are talking about the narrow, kind of in the road to, like what were the events leading right into the American Revolution or to the great glorious revolution for England? What are those last events? You can kind of track those. So that's where we are now. We're in this kind of narrow structure. We've kind of set the stage. We've looked at early secession. We looked at sectionalism. We looked at what happened with the Second Great Awakening. And now we're kind of in the churn. And if you remember last week, what we were looking at was coming out of the Mexican-American War, there were events that transpired relative to all the land. What do we do with the land? And because of Manifest Destiny, one answer would be, well, we just develop it. But because of the abolition movement, the other answer was we don't deal with it in a way that allows slavery to grow. So you can see with this, the idea that the current leaders were presuming was their strategy for dealing with slavery being a strategy that put time on our side. Now, I have been someone who has said often that I think that was would be a failed strategy. There's no evidence that time would have somehow ended slavery. Sometimes I'm asked, do you think we had to have a civil war to end slavery? My answer is yes. I know England did not, but their story is different than our story. And because it doesn't matter, we had the Civil War, so you move on from there. But the reason that the idea of popular sovereignty becomes so explosive is because you see our national leaders, well, honestly, they're stalling. They're hoping to not have to deal with it. And when you look at a map, let me go to a map, then I'll come back. Just this is a good enough map. When you look at a map, you see all this land to the west of Texas. And the idea for many was, well, that won't be populated for, gosh, maybe 100 years. Well, now they were wrong, of course. It was populated within, from that point, about 50 years. It was heavily populated within 60 years, so by the early 1900s. But nonetheless, what Congress was really trying to do was say, hey, I don't want to talk about it. So we'll say that there's no rules for this middle section. So remember, California was declared all free and Texas was declared all slave. But this middle section of land, well, we just won't deal with that. But what that did was that set in motion a potential that would undercut the old Missouri Compromise conclusion of 1820 and open the door for what really is, in my opinion, the start of the Civil War. We all know, generally, most of us, the Civil War, you would say, starts with the firing on Fort Sumter, or we know the first major battle is the Battle of Bull Run. We will look at both of those later in our sessions. But arguably, the war actually starts in 1855. And it comes because of this moment in the story. So the way I describe it, let me back up now, is that in every one of the run-up to great crisis, there is an unforeseen trigger event. It's the last on this list here. An unforeseen trigger event that propels government actions that leads to more tension. So here's the example from the American Revolution. You may remember, you know of the Boston Tea Party, of course. What you may not remember, but hopefully you do if you've been with me in these sessions, is that that event that led to that Tea Party was really nothing to do with the Americans. It actually was a choice by the British government to lower the cost of tea, lower taxes in America, in the colonists in America, and aid a British business, the East India Trading Company. So it had nothing to do with the American Revolution. But for Sam Adams, that event became a trigger event that then he pushes forward with the Boston Tea Party, and then that propels, the rest of the story, right? So it's just sort of unforeseen. You wouldn't think it had anything to do with it. And so similarly, deciding where we're going to put the railroad should seemingly have had nothing to do with the story. So when we pick up our journey here, you can see I've got these 4 of these top ones in red, meaning we've already done them, we've already shown them. So I'm going to show you the rest over the rest of our hour together. And so the next one is this unforeseen event, which is the choosing of a railroad. Okay, look, where should we put the railroad? But you may remember what we found out was for Southern leaders like Jefferson Davis, who at the time was Secretary of War, and would become a senator in the last 4 years, would go back to being a senator from Mississippi. Clearly, the best decision is to use the 32nd parallel, what is today the modern I-10, because it would avoid most of the mountains and go straight to New Orleans, where most of the goods would need to go anyway on the Mississippi River. But to abolition leaders, there's no way they want to do anything that economically would support the South. And so again, at a moment like that, what I want you to kind of grasp is this feeling of both sides of feeling put upon, of feeling attacked. And so for Southerners, they were kind of going, hey, look, the most logical answer is this, and you just won't do it because you hate us. And for abolition leaders, it was like, see, you guys in the South are always trying to economically improve yourself at the detriment of everybody else, and certainly at the detriment of slaves. So you can see, just like we saw when we talked about the British, and this happens, we're seeing in our own day, the two sides talk past each other. They're not really engaged in a conversation. They're not listening anymore. And so the unforeseen trigger event leads to the response that is the government action, which is Stephen Douglas's decision to try to organize this territory in purple on this map. And you may remember what I told you last time was he initially was just going to call it the Nebraska Territory. That's one of the tribes that's there. It wasn't going to call that wasn't going to all be one state. As you can see, all these big territories. It's just to kind of give a broad structure to the territory that eventually, as more people move in, it'll be subdivided. Well, the moment he did that, Southern leaders really freaked out and told him, we will not pass this bill. And remember, Douglas is doing it only because, back to this map, he wants the middle road for the railroad to come in. So the Corps of Engineers had studied the 37th or 39th parallel. It ended up being the 42nd parallel where you see I-80. But nonetheless, Douglas wants that because he knew, go back to this other map, he knows that it'll come eventually into Iowa and Missouri, and by railroad will go to Illinois. And his plan, as I told you last time, was to avoid being on the Mississippi River here, but instead use railroads in Illinois that would go to a little tiny town that he believed this would flourish, a place called Chicago. And of course, we know he's right. And so to get his bill passed, Douglas is like, okay, fine, I'll split it, but 2, because historically he knew we'd seen, back to Missouri Compromise, we always bring in 1, a slave state and a free state. So his logic was, we'll split the territory right here with this Kansas part being right next to Missouri, so that, according to Douglas, it'll become a slave state. And the upper part will become a free state. Well, Southerners are like, okay, that sounds great. And when it goes into the Senate, Douglas is really caught off guard on how much opposition he gets from Northern people, Northern senators and congressmen, mostly from either the Free Soil Party, and there's a few Whigs who are also starting to speak to this. And they're incensed that he made this decision. And if you look at the map, you can see why. Because all of the land in purple is north of the old Missouri Compromise line. And so for Northern abolition leaders, are like, hey, wait, we've already decided this. So, hey, we're not going there. And so Douglas is tap dancing and struggling to make his way through. And ultimately what he decides is he will reintroduce popular sovereignty into those lands. Well, now, obviously doing that undercuts the Missouri Compromise. As you can see, Douglas argued, hey, look, the Compromise of 1850 already did that, so I'm just kind of riding along. Again, I would say that this is Douglas and others who are stalling. They're thinking nobody will move to Kansas and Nebraska immediately, so there's no reason to panic. We'll just let it ride. And it shows how much they are really missing how intense people are about this issue, and how the movement of the country is outpacing the government. And again, that's one of the key attributes that you see on the road to great crisis, is that the people begin to feel like the government's just not paying attention. Now, the government's probably to some degree trapped, as politicians might be, of trying to make everybody happy, and they don't want to do anything too controversial. But nonetheless, the people on both sides of the political philosophical divide, they want action. We've got to do this now. And so it's really interesting. You can even, go back, as you can for all of our congressmen, read the debates. And when you read the debates, and I was doing this a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this, I mean, there is some fascinating stuff that people are talking about, which both shows how explosive things are and what the Congress leaders were thinking. Like, for instance, you can see people talking about a confederacy of states. I think I've told you this before. Going into our Civil War, you would always talk about the United States as a plural noun. The United States are. And so in that plural noun in our grammar, what you can see is the subconscious of a collection of states, each individual state working largely how it wishes. And that's very different than where we are now. So there's just a lot of interesting momentum kind of moving through the story. Eventually, Douglas will get this passed on May 25th, 1854. And he doesn't, in my opinion, really understand how explosive the decision is. But had he paid attention to events happening in Boston, he would have known, because as you can see, the day before, a fugitive slave named Anthony Burns was captured. Now, this is happening all the time, especially since the more strict Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 had been passed as part of the Compromise of 1850. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was extremely harsh. And one of the things that it does, and this Anthony Burns failed rescue is an example of how it does this, is that it highlights in the North how explosive, how degrading, how dehumanizing this event or this activity of slavery is. So again, most people in the North don't know anybody involved in slavery. In fact, they don't really, in many cases, have never even met a Black person ever in their life. So there's no interactions here. The fugitive slave law allowed a marshal or the people coming from the South to get a U.S. marshal, and they could be deputized. And they had the ability to deputize somebody on the spot. So imagine you're walking down Park Avenue in Winter Park, and a fugitive runs past, and 3 or 4 people are blocked behind, and they come running past. they have the ability to deputize you on the spot, even as you're just there shopping or at a restaurant. And if you refused to get involved to help capture the fugitive slave, you could be arrested, and often were arrested, and could face heavy fines for failing to participate in the apprehension of this person. So they get Anthony Burns, and he's captured. A mob tries to break him out. They cannot. Next week, there's a trial. There's famous pictures, which I wish I'd had one to show you, of the Boston courthouse roped off with huge anchor chains from the port to try to hold the mob back, which allowed abolitionists just a classic moment for PR, because they quickly were sketching pictures to put in newspapers of Boston and the Boston courthouse, which we of course want liberty and justice to be, in the courthouse, in chains, right? So they were able to kind of depict the idea that slavery and the slave power of the South has chained liberty in the home of liberty, arguably the birthplace of the Revolution, due to some of the other laws in the Fugitive Slave Act. He was not allowed to testify. It's still not very clear if he actually was a freed slave or if he'd been freed years before. One of the things the fugitive slave law allowed people to do is to become basically bounty hunters. And they would go and just kidnap anybody who was Black and could bring them back to the South. And of course, if that person really had not been a slave, their ability to get free was hampered by a very poor justice system in the South. And so many people were going into the North and kidnapping people who had been free all their lives. There were free people throughout the North. Well, in the end, Burns is shipped off to the South. It cost the government over $40,000, which today would be probably more closer to maybe $400,000. He was sold in auction for $900,000, which today would be maybe $10,000. So imagine us finding out the government spent $400,000 for this one fugitive, and then he was sold in auction for $10,000. So just the inequity and the inefficiency all really begins to show up as kind of a crisis moment, and it really throws in the face of people how bad this is. Most of the people who in Boston, who on June the 2nd thought about trying to attack me, they brought out the National Guard. So you've got this picture of this one man, he's in chains, and he's in the middle of walking of 100 soldiers. So that's why the mob didn't attack him. But for many people in Boston, the week before, they probably wouldn't have thought too much about the anti-slavery movement or been worried or thoughtful about what Southern leaders or the impact of Southern leaders in Congress would be. Now, more people are growing more and more incensed. And of course, we said last time with the success of Uncle Tom's Cabin, this is also really pushing the agenda in getting this news in front of people. Now, so taken together, these two things kind of point to us this idea of, as I've already said to you, the popular sovereignty is not really some kind of rah-rah, yay democracy. It's really Congress saying, we don't want to deal with this. We don't want to. We don't feel like we can. We're not going to have a good answer. And so I don't think leaders like Douglas were really aware, and certainly in Douglas's case, he doesn't really have an opinion about slavery. I think his view would be kind of it's not anything happening in Illinois. I don't personally have a slave, so whatever. And he's missing his moment for leadership. And quite honestly, there was really no leadership in the country at this point that's stepping forward to help kind of guide us in a new direction. So I want to bring this slide back up. We talked about this before. I'm back up here for a second. The idea of weak leadership is a common thing that you see every time the country rolls into the fourth phase. And it first emerges in the third phase of the 80 years, called the unraveling. So I just wanted to show you this slide again in case you're going unraveling. What does he mean? And again, this is when you look at the Anglo-American pattern of the Great Crisis pattern, where roughly every 80-ish years we go through this. I use the seasons as symbolism. Doesn't work as well in Florida because it's kind of summer all the time. But if you know the basic premise of spring and things come back to life, and summer there's a flourishing of life and growth and crops and gardens and flowers, and in fall it's the beginning of kind of closing down, and then of course winter, is the end. Well, so that's kind of where you are here, and the unraveling is, as Strauss and Howe called it, is this kind of moment when you lose good leadership that kind of moves us through. And again, in case you're curious, I know there's too much information here for you to grasp all at once, but this is our pattern of the history of this throughout. And when Becca sends you the link or you watch it on YouTube, if you want to pause here, you can look a lot deeper. Most of this information comes from Strauss and Howe. I've augmented it a little bit. There's a few times where I disagree with some of the years that they have, but the general premise of the ages that we've had, or the different patterns that we walk into are true. So we're in this time of moving into the 1850s, and certainly by 1854, 53, that is the unraveling. And now we're beginning to turn a corner into the actual Great Crisis itself, which will lead to its own explosive moment. And of course, what we're looking at now is the American Civil War. So I just wanted this here to kind of contextualize what I was just saying. Again, we covered this in a group, and there's actually a longer YouTube video series when I presented this information about the Great Crisis to the Winter Park Library. If you want that link, I can give it to you, and Becca can send it out if you want. You can always email me along the way. So here's where we are. We've seen Uncle Tom's Cabin, Transcontinental Railroad decision, Kansas-Nebraska Act, Anthony Burns Field Rescue, and then what comes is Bleeding Kansas. And this is the moment that I think you really see the explosion of the war. This is what I'm saying. I think the war starts here. What Douglas and Congress failed to realize is that people were going to want to move to this new territory of Kansas to stop the other side from winning. And they were going to move at such a pace. I mean, even in a modern, when you look at, say, the Midwest and the South, like Alabama, Mississippi, you had a period of maybe 20, 30 years from territory status to state status. And of course, as I already said to you, they were assuming decades and decades. Nobody was setting up, Douglas was not setting up the Nebraska Act because he wanted there to be a state there. He just wanted the Nebraska Act so that he and Congress could dole out federal lands and federal monies to a railroad industry to create the Transcontinental Railroad. So he's not thinking there'll even be a state. Well, they were caught off guard because Bleeding Kansas explodes as both pro and anti-slavery peoples will race to Kansas. There's stories of whole families from the South shipping off, the young ones to kind of expand. There's whole college classes, particularly at some of the abolition, more heavily abolition schools in Ohio and in Michigan and up in Boston and New England, whole college classes. Of course, a college class back then might only have 30 or 40 students, unlike today where there's, tens of thousands of students. And so they would just agree together, we're all moving to Kansas because we're going to stop slavery. And nobody in Congress expected this. And so, unfortunately, violence erupted. Everybody went armed. In fact, there were abolition groups who were Christian-based groups, and so we might imagine they would send Bibles or some kind of missionary information, but instead they sent rifles. People moved out there to fight. There were groups that came from Missouri who weren't planning on staying in Missouri, and for the abolition side, this group were called Border Ruffians. You, of course, can imagine the Missourians did not consider themselves ruffians. It reminds me of how in history, when we often will talk about a group being barbarians, I always remind people that those people probably did not perceive themselves as barbarians. It's really a statement of insider, outsider, who's kind of writing the history and who gets to be in and out. So in any case, and if you know your Western history, Kansas and Missouri have a long, long history that often shows up sometimes in sports between the colleges or the baseball teams. They don't like each other. If you're from Kansas or Missouri, you probably can testify to this or know somebody from there. And it just became chaotic. And again, to some degree, maybe like what we're perceiving in the country right now, it got out of control of the government. Both free people and free abolition people and slavery people formed their own governments. They promptly sent off representatives to DC. So Congress is in DC, and all of a sudden these people are walking in going, hey, I'm here from Kansas, but we already have somebody else from Kansas. And so there's a lot of confusion. Nobody's really able to figure out what's going on. Both groups start quickly trying to write their own constitutions. There's going to be 2 sets of constitutions sent to Congress. Congress is kind of going, what is going on? And then the violence kind of continues to escalate. Lawrence, Kansas becomes, probably the most famous moment of a town that was basically attacked like we would imagine we heard in the Middle Ages, of some town just randomly attacked by armed mobs. That led to the caning of Charles Sumner, who made a speech in Congress and the Senate accusing men like Stephen Douglas of exacerbating the violence. And he attacked a Southern gentleman, and his cousin, who was a congressman, walked over from the House of Representatives and attacked him in the Senate chambers. Nobody stopped him, beat Mr. Sumner senseless. He didn't die, but he came close to dying. And then, as you can see on the 25th, so just a few days after Lawrence, Kansas, John Brown, who you may know and who we'll spend more time with in just a few moments, John Brown had been somebody, was an example of basically an armed vigilante group. And in his case, he had his older sons with him, and they had been involved in the fighting. So in this moment, after the Lawrence, Kansas thing, he thought something more needed to be done. So he and his sons kidnapped 2 families and hacked them to death with swords, which hopefully you're all going, oh my gosh, that's terrible. They would probably say, hey, we're protesting against this hated thing called slavery, and you got to do what you got to do. And so then again, you can really see the tension, right? Where's the morality of the country? What do we need to do? For John Brown, he's going to be unrepentant. He's going to say, hey, look, the scourge of slavery demands this kind of action. So it really becomes tricky to try to see, how should I feel about this event? So events are spiraling out of control. And really, in Kansas and Missouri, the war, the fighting, the idea of there being armies, loose armies, will continue all the way to the 65. So they will have a 10-year experience of warfare. It's one of the reasons why I bring it up. In fact, there was a movie, now it's probably 20 years old or so, called Ride with the Devil. And it does a very good job. If you want to watch a movie, you probably can find it on Netflix or one of those, streaming kind of places. And it does a really good job of focusing on the Civil War in the West. There's very few movies about the West. You may remember the old, my mind's totally blank, The Outlaw Josie Wells. That's really post-Civil War. This movie, Ride with the Devil, focuses on the war itself. And again, they do a good job of showing how the war and the killing on both sides had already begun long before Fort Sumter. So another thing that happens that's on the kind of attributes that kind of exacerbates the problem is, with every great crisis, there's a significant change in communication. And so at this point, it's the expansion of the telegraph. So events like Bleeding Kansas or the sack of Lawrence that then led to the senator making the speech, even 10 years before would have been a week, 2, 3 weeks later. With the telegraph, you're kind of able to speed things up. So that speeding up of information has a positive effect, of course, but it also has the effect of kind of like wind over a fire, in that kind of spreading the sparks much, much quicker. In one sense, I'm criticizing Congress, but things were moving faster than they really had the ability to control things. So as you can see now, here's our list again, and you can see more of them now are in red. Well, the actions of the Bleeding Kansas moment is what kicked us into our next political voices. And these are our new political voices. We've already had some of these, but the abolitionists are going to form into a new group. So you may remember they first tried the Liberty Party, and then later, after the war, the Mexican War, they shifted to the Free Soil Party. in both those cases, they didn't really get a large enough support, although when Van Buren ran in 52, they got over 10% of the vote. So now it's kind of like, well, what do we do now? And I always kind of joke with my students and say, well, what they really wanted to do is think we need a cool name, because Free Soil Party, no offense, nobody's voting for that group. Kind of sounds kind of weird. So they thought, well, what can we do? And they looked around and they recognized that because of what happened under Jackson, the name of Jefferson's party was abandoned. Remember, Jefferson and Madison's first political party was the Republican Party. But then, of course, as we saw under President Jackson, that became the Democratic Republican Party, emphasizing the idea of more democracy, which we talked about that with Jackson. And then eventually, it just got too long to write. So they just shortened it to Democrat. So since the 30s, basically 25 years, Republican had not been a name. And so the abolitionists thought to themselves, this will give us the ability to contextually connect back into our history to Jefferson and Madison. And though you and I, of course, would say, wait, well, they were slaveholders. Nobody was thinking in those terms at that moment. They were thinking that these are some of our giants of the Republic, and it kind of, we're focusing on the idea of the Republic like it was initially established with our Constitution. It's the right move. So they do. And coming out of Bleeding, Kansas, they set this up. They'll run some local races in 55, but in 56, they will choose to run General Fremont, who had been involved in the Mexican War out in California, as an abolition party member. And to the shock of everyone, they came in second. So it was an interesting election in 56. I don't think I have a map for that. Here's the chart I've showed you before. The Whig Party ran. There were some Free Soil people who ran. They had a presidential candidate. There even were some leftover Liberty Party people. The actual most popular third party was a group called the American Party, but you know them, if you know your history, by their more cute name of the Know Nothing Party. It was kind of like Fight Club. If you remember that book or that movie about Fight Club, what's the first rule of Fight Club? You don't talk about Fight Club. It's like this party was mysterious. So you'd ask somebody, hey, what party are you in? They'd say, well, I don't know anything. I know nothing. They don't want to talk about it. But it was basically an anti-immigration party. It was a party that was more worried about rising immigration from places like Italy, Spain, and Ireland than they were about slavery. And had you asked some political scientists prior to the 56 election who was going to win, they would have said, oh, it's definitely going to be the anti-soil party, I mean, the anti-immigration party. But they didn't. The Republicans had the stronger grasp. And so this is really the death knell of the Whig Party. There were Whigs that ran, but what this meant was because they died and the Republicans came second, in our system, it's always been where it's just easier for there to be A or B choices, although I don't think that's necessarily the best for us as a people. So all of a sudden, you had Whigs who needed to find a new home. We saw the same thing when we studied the last time one of our parties died, which was the Federalist Party dying out in the early 1800s, and they all ended up becoming Republicans. Even John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, became a Republican, even though all of his political leanings would have been more in line with the old Federalist Party that Hamilton had set up. So what this meant now is you have a new political energy that's going to begin attracting moderates, which is going to be problematic for the Republicans, because when I say Republicans, you need to be thinking problematic for the Abolition Party. It was just an abolition party. But now, if they're going to be a national party, they're going to have to broaden. And that's going to cause deep problems. We'll see that when we do Reconstruction much later in the summer, that's where this problem comes. All right, so we're still charging forward. The last big thing that happens before the final blow is there's an economic panic. And every time we run into a great crisis, there's an economic disaster. So your mind should immediately be going, oh my gosh, that's what happened in 07 and 08 right now. Yep, it's one of the things that would be on the list of what led to our great crisis moment is our economic panic. And of course, the big thing about an economic panic as it relates to the crisis is that most people no longer are interested in whatever the philosophical divide is about. They're focused on survival. They're focused on paying their bills. They're focused on figuring out how they're going to survive. But notice also that an economic crisis typically leads to people feeling worse about the government. So think back to our last great crisis. President Hoover actually did not do a bad job. But if you ask most people casually, they'll tell you Hoover was a terrible president, FDR was amazing. When in reality, they basically did the exact same things to try to address the economic crisis. But most people felt as if the government was not interested. And so similarly here, and I would suggest ever since '08, you get the same experience in our own time, that people feel that frustration. So now that gives us everything on the list, but this last one. In every moment going to a great crisis, and there is here for the Civil War, there's one major explosive event that then will lead to the galvanizing. Now, that's not always the last thing, but it often is the most stark moment. And for us, it's actually 5 things together. And the way I describe it is that to get an explosion, you need dynamite, you need a fuse, and you need a spark. And so as we kind of move in this last period of 1857 to 1860, there are 5 events that conspire together to do that, to give us the dynamite, the fuse, and the spark. Now again, I wish I was there with you right now, because I want to pause and just make sure there were no questions. And of course, we're doing it through Zoom. And of course, sometimes when I ask for questions, you don't have any, which is great. But I wish there was a way for you to ask me questions. Of course, if you're at your house and you can use the chat, by all means, feel free to chat to me or to the group at large if you want to. So we're going to dive on in, but I just want you to understand, we've now seen from 1848 to 1857, all the major events happen. And now, really all we need is that spark to blow it up, and then we'll dive in. And of course, already, Lincoln's going to get elected in 1860. This isn't a surprise, so I'm just wanting you to kind of get there, but we got to get into the moment. And the thing that happens first is stacking, what I call stacking the dynamite, involves back to Kansas, quite honestly, and the Fugitive Slave Act at the same time. And it gets us to the Dred Scott case. In the 1830s, Dred Scott was a slave, of course, and his master had moved from the South to Missouri, and then from Missouri up to the Northwest. I think he went to Michigan. But at some point, he kind of is in free territory, Indiana maybe. And it's a longer journey. They actually come back, and at some spot, Dred Scott gets married, and at some spot that master actually basically hires him out to be like a worker on a farm up in the north. And he goes down south, and then they get reconnected. And at some point, he dies, the master, and his wife, who owns these 2 slaves, so again, this is a valuable piece of property, she wants everything back. She brings him back. Dred Scott, to his credit, never tried to run away. And you kind of think he could have probably just headed off to Canada, but he never tried to, he and his wife. And so when he comes back, he tries to get the woman, the widow, to let him buy his freedom. She's not interested because it's a financial investment for her now that her husband's dead. So he sues because he had been living in territory where there was not supposed to be slavery. And so his argument that goes before the court was that because he was living north of the Missouri Compromise line, he should be allowed to be free. Now, and the case goes back and forth. You can see it's a 10-year journey of him suing and being in court. And there are moments, as for all, if you have your political history, you guys are all very familiar with, where you have people going, they'll win, and the other side will countersue, and they'll appeal, and it's back and forth, back and forth. Finally, in '53, it gets to the federal level. And in February of '56, the same time Kansas-Nebraska is happening, it gets to the Supreme Court. The court is led by Roger B. Taney, or you hear some people call him Taney. He was an appointee by Jackson, the Southerner, and he will be the Chief Justice for, you can see, almost 30 full years. He'll be the Chief Justice who swears in Lincoln as the president in 1860. He will fight with Lincoln, as we shall see, over some very controversial decisions that Lincoln does. So Taney gets this case as the Chief Justice, and the court rules, and they rule against Scott. And so Scott loses, goes back to being a slave. Now later, the widow remarries. She and her new husband's like, yeah, I don't want to have any slaves. He was actually an abolitionist. He gets him sold to freedom. So he gets him into freedom. He doesn't, unfortunately, Dred Scott does not get to experience freedom very long because he passed away. But what Taney rules is shocking and really kind of is why this is kind of stacking the dynamite. What he rules is what many people in the South would have told you they believed, but nobody in the North had ever heard them say it. And even John C. Calhoun, in his very famous letter we talked about, didn't say it like this. Taney basically says in his support, in his, they always write up the support of the decision, and there's always a dissension if there's a dissension, that slaves are property, that there are no rights that a Black person could ever expect to have in the United States. They are not and cannot and will not ever be citizens. And by not being citizens, there's nothing in the Constitution for them. It was a shocking admission, although it was an accurate admission based on how the country had gone to that point. That he said it and that the court ruled on it, as opposed to just some random person, is what really ups the ante here. It really brings forth this moment where you're like, wow, okay. But then he went one step forward. And this is often not really brought up, and I think people miss this, that made it more important than even the statement about slaves in general, is that the Supreme Court ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. And now you know how the Supreme Court, and you know the whole structure of our government, a law can get passed, and even decades later, the court, if there's a case that comes before them, can decide in how they choose to declare the case that part of what may have happened is that there is an unconstitutional law. And what Taney is arguing actually has merit, and I tell my students, you're actually on his side with this, because what he argues is Congress should not be able to make any law about where you can or cannot take your property. So that becomes like the really big deal here, is that by saying that they're not people, they're property, they'll never be citizens, he's then making the next logical step of saying, of course, Congress should have no ability to limit where you take your property. Well, all of a sudden it's like, what do we do with that? And so, of course, in the middle of this moment is the midterm elections, in which you've got the reality of there's war happening in Kansas on this very point. At this very moment, both free and slave-led governments in Kansas are writing constitutions. And what are they supposed to do if the tension is about, to some degree, the Missouri Compromise, and it's just been declared unconstitutional? And for abolitionists, both white and Black, this is so egregious, because to say that these flesh human beings are not human beings is just flabbergasting on its face and insulting to all of the men and women who were living and breathing and showing their own intelligence and their own will and their own passion for life, that they should have their ability to choose and make choices like any one of us do. And to say they're never going to have any rights whatsoever. For the abolition movement, this was almost a declaration of war. Well, this is what the Lincoln and Douglas debate centers around. Lincoln, who at this point is not, he's well known in Illinois. He was a congressman. You may remember I mentioned that during the Mexican War. He's been a lawyer very successfully, working with the railroad. He was really one of the first ones to see that a transcontinental railroad would be a really good idea. So Lincoln challenges him. Now remember, at this point, There's no direct elections for senators, which is quite honestly the way it should be today. That's a different conversation. And so the idea that they would debate in front of people was unknown. But Lincoln challenged Douglas. Douglas perceived himself to be a very eloquent speaker, and he was. So he said, sure, I'll do that. It wasn't that they were going to vote for either man. They would be voting for state congressional, state representatives, and whoever won the most of those would win. And the Democratic Party was really so strong, there really would not be much of a challenge here. But in the process, this is going to highlight Kansas-Nebraska, popular sovereignty, the Dred Scott decision in a way that all eyes in the country turn and focus on this race. And so the decision is that they will have 7 debates in these cities, which you can see kind of move from north to south. And you can see up in Freeport, obviously Chicago is not important because there would have been a debate in Chicago if it was an important city. At this point, Chicago is insignificant in the state of Illinois. And so they're going to go north to south, as you can see, and try to be all over the state and everything. Of course, if you love debates and you love passion, you can actually order books that have the entire debate. The way they did it was one man would go first and have an hour-long talk. Then the next man would get an hour and a half to rebut. And then the first man would get 30 minutes. You can't even imagine Americans today being able to sit through the first hour, let alone the whole thing. I tell my students in our class it's an hour and 15 minutes, and many of you think it's too long. So, these guys went at it. And then at the next place, so that's how they did it in Ottawa. And I think Douglas went first. So Douglas, Lincoln, Douglas. At Freeport, Lincoln got to go first. So he got the hour. Then Douglas went second, got an hour and a half. Then Lincoln got the last part. So it's fascinating if you ever read the debates, because you have to kind of read them as a continuation. So after Freeport, for instance, since Douglas got the last bit, Lincoln got the last bit, so Douglas was first in Jonesboro. And so Douglas would get up and say, well, in the last debate, Lincoln said blah, 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 blah. So to really kind of get the flow, you have to kind of journey through all 7 of the conversations to really understand kind of the argument, the flow of the argument. And it's a fascinating debate. In fact, I wish we could just spend a whole day right here because we could read some of the things that they said. Lincoln goes into it having made his very famous House Divided speech. And so this sort of sets the stage and is saying, due to Dred Scott's decision about Missouri Compromise, so there's no way to have a rule, and popular sovereignty, basically what's happening is slavery could be anywhere. And that is the extent of the Supreme Court's decision. If someone wanted to go to Minnesota or Missouri or not Missouri, New Jersey with a slave and set up a farm or a working place with slavery, they could. And so Lincoln is pointing this out saying, hey, that's not what we want, is it? And again, remember what I told you, Douglas is to some degree ambivalent. He's kind of like, well, I don't really care, And so he kind of bounces back to what becomes known as the Freeport Doctrine that would suggest, so this is actually controversial, would suggest that a local city or a region or state could establish laws to ban slavery, and I guess by extension, some form of property in defiance of the Supreme Court decision. So I don't know how that would have really worked out. And Lincoln kind of attacks him. Lincoln's a lawyer, so he kind of picks on this point that that's not really workable. But Douglas just keeps saying, hey, look, most everybody in Illinois, nobody wants slavery, although down in the South and the west of Illinois, that wasn't exactly true, because they could see the success of slaveholding farms in Missouri and Kentucky. So there were some farmers who would have wanted that. And go back to this map, when you read Lincoln's speeches, particularly Jonesboro and Alton, which is again on those borders with slaveholding states, he tap dances. Remember, Lincoln is not an abolitionist. Lincoln is someone who is a moderate. He's a former Whig. So he cares personally and seems to have a personal opposition to slavery, but he's not an abolitionist. For Lincoln, he's going to argue it's a moral wrong, and he's going to highlight the Declaration of Independence. But of course, Douglas spins this on him and says, so what you're basically saying is you want an all-powerful government who will enforce morality. Well, Lincoln has to tap dance away from that And then Douglas attacks him and says, so are you saying that black and white people are equal? And Lincoln in the South of Illinois is really soft on this. He's kind of like, well, they have the same God-given characteristics, but they're not really equal in political or social means, which may have sounded good for white voters, but certainly is not what the abolitionists in Illinois or anywhere else really wanted to hear. So as they go along, both men kind of emphasize the conspiracy theory that was now really gaining momentum in the North and the South, but they're inaccurate for what they're charging. So Douglas is saying, Douglas says that Lincoln represents the abolitionists. As I already told you, Lincoln's not an abolitionist. In fact, many of the abolitionists were distancing themselves from Lincoln because he was a moderate. Lincoln's saying, well, Douglas shows the conspiracy of the powerful planter class to kind of control and spread slavery. At this very moment, there are Democrats in the South who are sending money to Lincoln's campaign because they're so mad at Douglas. They think Douglas has not, as one of the leading senators, and it's very clear Douglas is probably going to run for president in 1860. And so as one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, they really wanted Douglas to be in there fighting, for slavery and for the South, and he's not. And so again, it's interesting, they're Southerners who are supporting Lincoln because they didn't like Douglas. And again, back to the abolition side, it shows you that even the South, at least in 58, they don't see Lincoln as an abolitionist either. So the big takeaway here is that, again, we've got this crisis building, and you can say, as I said, the dynamite is now stacked against the foundation of the country. Now we need to get the fuse. And the fuse will come in two very explosive ways. So you remember we just told you about the Burns failed rescue. Well, in a little town in Ohio, in the north of Ohio to the west of now Cleveland, is the city of Oberlin. There's a very famous school there. It was one of the very first colleges to have women and African Americans and white men kind of mixed. They had mixed their public schools, even though Ohio, which was abolitionist leaning, had not said you could do that. They did it anyway. On the map there, you can see I've circled Ripley. Ripley, Ohio was often seen as Freedom Town, USA, for the Underground Railroad in the West. It's one of the main stops to go, and you can see some of those lines that would go from Ripley to Oberlin. And of course, you know that the Lake Erie is right above Cleveland. So you're really just a boat ride away from Canada. So it was really a final stop on the way. Another fugitive, this man's name is John Price, was captured. But Oberlin's a lot smaller than Boston. And this time, pretty much the entire male population of the town attack where he's being held. And he wasn't being held in the prison. He was being held at the Wellington Hotel, which isn't there anymore, but you can go and see some spots where it's kind of, where it was. And they free Price. They capture him. A couple people are killed. A U.S. Marshal is killed. So again, you think about some of the violence trend right now, we don't like to see police officers get killed, and you just wonder what's going on when you see police officers acting poorly, and there's a lot of stuff happening. Well, here you had a U.S. Marshal get killed. The U.S. government will put out warrants for the arrest of all of the group that became known as the rescuers. They'll all turn themselves in, and sort of like what Dr. King does in the 60s, they'll pack the jail. They won't post bail. They're basically daring the government, the federal government, to try to try them. Meanwhile, the local sheriff will put out an arrest warrant for the men who had captured John Price in the first time on a charge of kidnapping, that they'd kidnapped a citizen of the city, and they didn't have a right to do that. And so the Oberlin and Wellington rescue spreads like wildfire throughout the North and even into the South. Members of the rescuers will go on tour. But what mostly we like to link this is that a man who I've already introduced to you, who lived just south of Oberlin, took this and decided this is the moment we have to go further. And that man was John Brown. John Brown was raised in Hudson, Ohio, which is just miles south of Oberlin. His father was a station master on the Underground Railroad. You could say Brown grew up in a town that hated slavery, in a house that hated slavery, with a father who hated slavery, and who had trained his son and his family to fight against slavery in an active kind of way. I already told you about John and his taking his sons to Kansas and the murder of the two slaveholding families. So after the Oberlin Wellington rescue, Brown decides, and he's got support of like some financial deep pocket people in the North, we're going to have to do something more explosive. And his idea, at least on the face, was to go down to Virginia and attack the U.S. Armory at a place called Harpers Ferry, which you can see there on the map. The idea, as he expressed it, was that they were going to attempt to raise an army of slaveholders. Now, the idea of armed slaves certainly was one of the big bugaboo, scary thought processes for the South. So just the idea of this would have been controversial and negative and frustrating for Southerners. Brown rents a farm in Maryland and is able to sneak into the arsenal and successfully capture the arsenal. Now, it doesn't go well from Brown, which ever since, 160 years later, many historians debate, was Brown really believing he could cause the uprising? It's not really clear. There's some who said Brown was a failure. He failed in everything he did. I would go all to the contrary, that he actually was very successful in the one thing he really cared about, which was abolition. And so here, the theory is maybe what Brown was doing was at least acknowledging that if I'm not able to get the slave uprising, if I'm captured and killed in the process, then I could become maybe a martyr to the cause, which will help inflame other people. But notice where Brown is at, and many abolitionists are with him, and that is there's not going to be a way to legally talk our way out of this. It's going to come to blows. Now, Brown is captured. Most of his group, including his sons, are killed. I think there's like 3 or 4 others besides him who are captured and not killed. In the end, he's tried in Virginia for treason against Virginia. That's really critical to note because remember, he was attacking and capturing a U.S. arsenal. So go back to that mindset of a confederacy of states, of individual states' rights. For the North and abolition leaders, the fact that he was tried for treason by Virginia was really the most explosive thing. To them, it was evidence of how the South was determined to dictate events, how the South was kind of drunk with power in their own sense of we get to control things, even though numerically the South by this point was barely a third of the voting population. Southerners had obviously a completely opposite viewpoint. For them, Brown was just the tip of the iceberg and evidence that clearly the North, now they would talk about the North at large, although I think at this point more accurately, it still would have been just the abolitionists. But to them, the North was so determined to crush Southern culture that they would just murder, they would just come and kill, they would just attack. Notice the South's not saying that the North is trying to end slavery. The South would say, you're trying to ruin our culture. So John Brown's arrest, his attempt, and then his capture and his arrest, and finally his execution was really this explosive moment that set things in motion. He's executed, as you can see, in December of '59, right as we're heading into the election year. And you can see what the implications are. One, he makes a statement that's very prophetic. He says, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Lincoln will kind of echo him later when you get to the second inaugural, which we'll maybe look at when we get there. More importantly, for the war we're going to look at, all across the South, local militias. And the South had already been always more martial and people volunteering for kind of militia duty. But, nobody really took it serious and with that act. Now the South starts training. They basically start training what will be the nucleus of the Confederate Army. And when we spend those first 2 years of the war looking at how bad the Union Army operates, or maybe we would say how good the Southern Army operates, now you know why. At the same time, this event will splinter the Democrat Party. As we head into the election of 1860, which we'll cover next time, it is clear the Democrat Party will not be united because that sectional division between North and South is now too strong. And Northern Democrats are going to be trapped because they're certainly not abolitionists. They still believe in states' rights, but they're not going to be able to support a pro-Southern point of view that really begins demanding an amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee the right to slavery anywhere in the country. And I'll show you this slide and we'll come back to it just so you can see it. These are the 4 men who will run. And so when you see that phrase federal slave code, that's basically talking about how the Southerners, who John Breckinridge is the Southern candidate, the Democratic Southern candidate, they're determined to protect, they would say, their way of life. And the only way to protect their way of life would be, in their minds, a federal amendment. And so Northern Democrats coming off of the John Brown, Harpers Ferry moment, they can't go there. So this will set up the very explosive election of 1860. Of course, you already know how it works out, but there's still a couple of twists you may not know about, and we will cover those next time. Thank you so much for being here. I did get one note in the Zoom chat to point out that there's a movie that's more recent that talks about what I told you about the Fugitive Slave Act kidnapping people, and that's the movie 12 Years a Slave. Does a really good job. It's recent, like 3 or 4 years ago. Does a really good job. It's kind of hard to watch, but it does a good job of this idea of free Black people being kidnapped and taken to the South, never a slave. Well, that's a lot of information. I promise you next time we'll start with a recap to make sure everybody's good about what we learned in our road to the Civil War. As always, if you have any questions, just email me, or you can get them to Becca, and Becca will email me. I'm so glad to see all of you, particularly you guys in Stover, but everybody on the call, and I appreciate you spending time with me. Thank you so much, and appreciate it. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Carl.